Stanford University.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Stanford Roundtable panelists and our moderator, Charlie Rose.
Thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations to you for this reunion. I ran into one graduate of Stanford, and it said on his card, class of 74. And he said they made a mistake. It was 84. It was 74. I'm also thrilled to be here because of Johnny Dawkins, your great basketball coach. And if Krzyzewski retires at Duke, we're coming after him. I'm just telling you right now. I never believed that I would be able to be on this court. And I knew it would be in a capacity not as a player. But I can also tell you of one great story about a wonderful Stanford alumnus who I got to know, Chief Justice Rehnquist. And he and I were doing an interview once at the Supreme Court chambers, and we started talking about the Final Four. And he said to me, I'll bet you that Stanford will outlast Duke in the Final Four. I said, how much do you want to bet? He said, $5. I said, done. And so there it was, and so it turned out that Duke actually lasted longer than Stanford. So I was not going to remind the Chief Justice of the United States that I won the bet. Lo and behold, there comes in the mail with a letter from the Chief Justice and a $5 bill saying, you won, wait till next time. So, and I have framed that. We are here to have a conversation about where we are in terms of the global economy, not just the United States, but the world, because all of us know that we now live in a global world in which we go, because of communications and transportation, we go across boundaries all the time. And certainly the internet has enabled us to do that. I want to introduce you to the people that are here as part of this panel, some that you know, and I expect most of them you know. Let me begin with John Hennessy, your president. You're a former provost. You're a computer science and former dean of the School of Engineering, who has done a lot in terms of having universities think about economics and sustainability, and endowments too. Also here from Mexico is another Stanford alumnus who got his master's and his PhD in economics here, Guillermo Ortiz. Governor of the Bank of Mexico, and an important figure in terms of looking at the global economy and where it's going. And he was former finance minister and has had a series of distinguished roles, even at, including the IMF. Also here, Penny Pritzker. She is a Stanford business and law school graduate after getting her undergraduate at Harvard. Some people in this crowd would say that's trading up. She is a Chicagoan, and I think it's fair to say that the man in the White House owes her a lot because she was finance chairman, and early on, when it made a difference, she was helping the candidacy of Barack Obama. She's now on the Economic Advisory Committee. And was co-chair of the inaugural law school and business school. Next is Caroline Hoxby, who you know, who has a remarkable academic record, is a graduate of Harvard as well, and was a Rhodes Scholar and has a great reputation as a teacher. She's I think it's a Balmer professor here in economics with a special emphasis on education, public economics, and we'll talk about education and the crucial role that it will play in terms of the economic and the political and the global future for this country and for every country. It is playing an increasing importance as brains influence how we see the future. Also here, and Eric Schmidt. He didn't go to Stanford, but he's done all right. He went to Princeton and got his undergraduate degree. Then he went to a place, I think it may be a rival of yours, called the University of California at Berkeley. where he got his master's degree and his PhD in computer sciences. Went on, as all of you know, went on to have a remarkable track record in technology, first at Sun Microsystems, Norvell, and now he is the chairman and the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt. Also here is another one of your own, Garth Soloner, who is, since 2009, has been Dean of the School of Business. And has a distinguished teaching record at MIT and at here, and with a special emphasis on entrepreneurship and management and understanding the qualities that we need in terms of leadership to go forward. So it is a remarkable panel. Now, what we're going to talk about here this morning is the ideas of where we have come from, where we are in this global crisis, and where we have to go, and what's changed, and what does it mean to all of us, and what are the factors at play, and what are the decisions being made or should be made? What kinds of strategies ought there be for the future? How do we make sure that in whatever country you're in, you have the kinds of resources, the kinds of talent, the kinds of education, and the kind of leadership that will get us there? So I want to begin with President Hennessy and say, give us a sense of what you think, because you're responsible for training future leaders who will go spread across this globe and hopefully play a role in the private and public sector where they go. What kind of tools, what kind of skills, what kinds of ideas are necessary in order that we can come out of this place we are now and come back to a place that hopefully will be better and less vulnerable to what happened to us?
Well, Charlie, that's a great question. I think we think about two parts to it. Clearly, where will the new economic opportunities be? Where will the next Google or the next Yahoo or the next Sun Microsystems come from? So we're clearly investing in lots of technologies. I think one key area we're making large research investments in is the whole area of green technology. New battery technologies, new approaches to energy, as well as solving some of our other environmental challenges around water. The remarkable thing about universities is that they are integrated education and research institutions. So at the same time we push the technology forward, we also develop the next generation of leaders. I think the other thing we're thinking a lot about is trying to turn our students into global citizens, to think much more broadly, send them outside the United States, get a feel for what it's like to be in China or to be in Latin America and see what economic growth is going on, and help them become fluent and capable of working across national boundaries, because that is the future. You go down to Silicon Valley now, every single startup has a division in India or in China that's working with them here, and I think that is the future and the way we need to train our students to be. We need to train them to be comfortable in that setting and to be successful in that setting.
Guillermo, I want to look back just for a second. How bad was this economic crisis, and how did it get there? And where are we today in terms of stopping the slide and beginning the recovery?
Well, this is the worst crisis since the Second World War. I mean, according to many of the indicators, and how we got here, I think it's a combination of factors. You know, we have to remember that before the crisis erupted, we had some very good years in the world economy. High growth, low inflation, very low real interest rates, a sensation that, there were good times. And that led, of course, to the mispricing of risk in financial markets, to development of innovative products, financial innovation. So it was a combination of, I would say, macroeconomic factors that led the stage for a sensation of high growth in property prices, development of finance and so on. And the fact that in these years, in these last few 6 or 7 years prior to the crisis, the financial markets were subject to several shocks, like 9/11, the dot-com bubble, and the Enrons and so on. And the financial markets were able to absorb each one of these shocks. So confidence grew even more that the financial system was very resilient, and the institutions supporting the financial system, like rating agencies, regulators, international organizations, were sufficient to have this system absorb shocks, allocate efficiently resources, and manage risks. I mean, this is the kind of overall stage. And then things began crumbling apart, and there's a long story behind that. But essentially, it started in the US with the subprime market. And the amazing thing of this is that it led eventually to a loss of confidence in financial institutions in this country, and then it spread all over the world. And the thing that is very unusual is this simultaneity on how, after the Lehman Brothers affair,
Right.
confidence was shattered around the world, and the transmission mechanism between the financial variables and the real sector of the economy was so quick. So I think that is a very unusual feature. This is the first truly global financial crisis, because all the economies are interconnected. And how do we get out of this? Well, I guess this is the subject of
We will get to that.
yeah.
Eric, you travel around the globe. China is leading the economic, Asia's leading the economic recovery. For the current fiscal year, they're talking about a growth rate of 2009 of 7 to 8%. Are we in recovery now? Is the trend for 2010 a continued recovery?
We are, and it will be. If you look at results from corporations in the United States, everyone's seeing some improvement in their businesses. It appears that the low was March, April, and we don't know, of course, what the high will be, but we know that things are improving. Balance sheets are improving. Joblessness has not improved yet, but that's always a lagging indicator. So if you look at it in aggregate, you'd say it's a classic hard recession with a classic recovery going forward. What's different, of course, is the simultaneity, as we discussed. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing everything come up at the same time as well, and that's a very good sign.
We'll talk about regulation also, and we'll talk about sort of lack of confidence, and back to the sense of decisions that were made, Garth, by the previous administration, when you had Tim Geithner at the New York Fed, when you had Ben Bernanke still as head of the Fed, and Hank Paulson as Secretary of the Treasury. Two basic decisions were made, having to do with the stimulus and then having to do with the financial sector and TARP money. Has that worked?
Well, I think the perspective you have to take is of the greatest crisis in the last 80 years. And so job one was to increase liquidity in the financial markets and to stabilize them. And I think that job was done. You can quibble about exactly how it was done, but that job certainly was done. The next task was to start to create confidence that the economy would come back and get people involved in that. And that, I think, was the idea of the stimulus. The stimulus money has so far really not had much impact, and we will start to see that impact to a much greater extent next year.
All right. Penny, you own businesses that are involved in consumer spending. What's happening with respect to consumer spending in America?
Well, consumer spending is way down, and it's down for a couple of reasons. First of all, people's home prices have deteriorated dramatically, and so that's the largest asset that any family typically has. And so that affects the balance sheet of the family. Consumer spending is down also because of the threat of unemployment and growing unemployment. And the third reason consumer spending is down is that access to credit has been severely limited for the average American. Your credit card has become either extremely expensive, or your access to credit through your credit card has been limited through the various both regulations that have gone on, as well as the various banks reacting to the portfolios and the problems they have in their credit card portfolio. So this confluence of things is really affecting the psyche of the consumer and their attitude about spending.
When you look at jobs as a lagging indicator, is it possible that we will not have the kind of recovery in the job market that will take us back to previous levels?
Well, I think that it's a question of timing. I think we will have jobs during the recovery. The question is how fast and how soon. The Council of Economic Advisors came out yesterday and said it's potentially that jobs will lag all the way through 2010. And so that's a real concern for the administration. But long term, this country is going to create jobs. We have, first of all, we are an innovative country. We come up with innovations. We're committed to green technology, and retrofitting is going to require a number of new jobs. We've got, we have 1 million new households that form each year in our country. That requires construction to house those folks, to house the economic activity that they've got. So jobs are going to come. Jobs are going to come in healthcare as well, because we have such a robust healthcare system. So I think jobs will come with the recovery. The question is how fast, and I think that the indications are that's going to take time.
One of the things the president has said that he wanted to do with the stimulus is focus on healthcare, focus on climate, and focus on education. When will we see the results of the stimulus in terms of its impact on jobs and its impact on the economy? Because most people I talk to don't believe they're seeing it yet.
Well, I think it's a question. It may be that we're not going to be able to see very much effect of the stimulus package itself. One thing to understand about jobs is that jobs are very different than asset markets. The asset markets, as soon as I think that Google is going to do better, I want to buy Google stock, and so Google's price is going to start going up.
How could it do better?
But employers are not like that. I don't say to myself, gee, I think in a year I'm going to need to hire someone, so I'll hire him now in expectation. You don't do that. You wait until you actually need him to do something. So that's why unemployment can stay pretty high, even when the economy and the financial sector started to recover. I think that what we need to recognize about American recessions now is that unemployment, there's a good side to unemployment. It reallocates labor from jobs where maybe people weren't as productive as they could be to jobs where they're going to be more productive. It's a painful process, but it is a process that means that every time we come out of a recession, labor productivity is at an all-time high. And it's precisely because everyone's been reallocated to jobs where they're most productive. But every recession we've had recently, skilled workers have come out of the recession looking better than unskilled workers. And that's why I think we do care about the long-term effects of the stimulus on education and things like that, because there's a long-term trend away from unskilled workers and towards skilled workers, and I can guarantee they'll come out of the recession, unskilled workers will come out looking worse.
Eric is going to jump in this, let me just say for the benefit of all of us here, I don't want to simply traffic cop up here. I want all of you to engage, so we're past the introductions now, so jump in. Eric?
There's a reason to be optimistic.
Right.
What do these queries have in common? Weight loss, fitness, cooking, recipes, self-help, and mental health. They peaked in the spring, and they're going down now. What do these queries have in common? Restaurants, clubs and nightlife, ticket sales, movies, dancing, etc. They're all on their way up. Trust me, we're in a recovery.
Okay, but so
America is back in business
all right. So consumers are in fact spending.
and using credit.
Yeah. But let me just stay with this notion of the stimulus too. What's the payoff for this money in terms of climate, an area that you're enormously interested in, in terms of the investment we're making?
In the February activity, the stimulus bill was designed as a 2-year activity, $80 billion, excuse me, and it had a lot of constituencies that were sort of at that. And a lot of the money went for education, public safety, infrastructure improvements, and so forth. There were about $60 billion that went into various forms of renewable energy, including $5 or $10 billion in building out a smart grid, a whole bunch of things like that. And the president's agenda basically said that if you're going to invest, you might as well get a twofer. You might as well, in addition to spending money, which of course brings up employment and so forth and so on, you might as well address some of the structural infrastructure issues that we have in our country with an eye to building a new energy infrastructure. And that energy infrastructure is fundamentally about renewables and transmission. The renewables are there. All the math says that we can power most of the country from some percentage of the desert, but all the sources of power are not where the people are, and you have to get it using a smart grid.
All right.
The same principle applies to education, and we're seeing that in the stimulus money. There's 10% of the stimulus money in education is going towards Race for the Top and other funds that are really used to incent creativity and best practices within education. And you're seeing tremendous benefits from that, even before that money is being spent.
In fact, Race for the Top is one of the really bright spots in the stimulus package, because it's finally broken through this notion that maybe we should reward people for excellence.
Right, and it's also, what it's doing is it's having a great effect in advance of even the money's being spent, which is that legislatures are changing laws to allow, for example, I believe in California, to marry up teachers and the performance of students and that kind of data, so we can track both student performance and teacher performance and really have better data about how are we doing with education. And we need to really, I mean, what the President and our Secretary of Education are committed to is we have to have international education standards in our country, in our public schools, K through 12. And we have got to raise our standards of what's acceptable in order that we produce skilled workers who can be successful in a global economy.
I really want to agree with you about what the federal government can and can't do on education. The federal government doesn't actually spend most of the money on education in the United States. What it can do is create leverage and get the states to do the right thing. And the federal government right now is having a lot of success, and in fact it's kind of a continuation of the previous administration's policies in using its money to get the states to do the right thing, to hold schools accountable.
But do the states have, I'm in California, do the states have the money to do the right thing?
You know, I really don't think it's, California is, let me set aside California for a minute. Let me set aside California for a minute. Most states in the United States, minus our wonderful, beautiful state, which is 1/10 of the U.S. and one of the largest countries in the world, right. Most states in the United States spend plenty of money on public education. The problem is not money per se as much as it is figuring out how to do what works in schools. And there, I think we have actually, we now are in a position to know much more about what works in schools than we knew 20 years ago. That's the one place where technology and data have really helped us, where we can now be much more scientific about figuring out what works, and the federal money is trying to leverage that.
The issue, I want to come to the financial sector in just a second, Guillermo, in terms of what has happened with respect to the financial sector. But in terms of education, most of the emphasis is K through 12, right?
That's right.
That's where the issue is.
Right.
That's right.
Because the United States continues to have a huge leadership.
Correct. Although we depend at the graduate level, particularly in science and technology, on importing lots of graduate students because we don't produce enough out of our K-12 system. Because if it's broken somewhere, it's broken deeply in science and math education.
We're also going to talk about what's happening in terms of India and China. Are most of the graduate students staying in the United States? Or are they going to India or China or Mexico or somewhere else?
I think it's a mixed bag. You'd see that most of them at a Stanford or Berkeley probably are staying at least for some period of time. I think as you go to other institutions, you'd find more people going back.
We don't give them visas, guys.
Yeah,
exactly.
I know. We
Right?
have a real problem.
This is a brilliant strategy. Bring the smartest people in the world to Stanford, educate them, and kick them out of the country.
Invest
Right, it's
$100,000
terrible.
Brilliant
a year and throw
strategy.
them out.
Great for America.
As it
I
is
hope
often said, we should staple a green card to a diploma.
Absolutely.
Right.
Don't you think a Stanford graduate education is a reasonable condition for actually becoming a U.S. citizen?
Well, let me just tell
It's
you.
just unbelievable. And by the way, we have tried and we have tried. It is the stupidest policy in all of government.
hello, we
Take
have-
the smartest people who are going to build companies and pay taxes and have them do it in another country.
There is a thing called a bully pulpit, and both you and Penny know the incumbent the occupant of the White House very well. I mean, how much of a priority is this for this administration?
I think it's a huge priority, but when one's going to deal with immigration law as a policy matter is a timing question, and so they're very focused on this issue.
Everybody understands this. Everybody understands this, and they always say, "Oh, okay, yes," but they won't actually vote on it. We've come back with ideas like you've you've gone to college, you've been in one of these programs, and you get an H-1 visa for that. They won't even carve that out. It's the peculiar logic of government. It actually makes no sense.
All right.
Well, even getting to the DREAM Act, with a very simple piece of law which would take young people who came to this country, who didn't come with citizenship, who complete high school and go on to college, and give them the opportunity to become citizens. And I think this is something we have to do. It makes no sense to take somebody who came here at 2 or 3 with their parents and say, you got a Harvard education. Now go back to where you came from. It's a ridiculous situation.
I told your president last night at dinner that I just had an opportunity to meet with a delegation from China who were in the United States, and a high-level delegation, and there was a dinner, and the man sitting next to me, I said to him, what are you doing here? He's saying, I'm trying to get every graduate of your universities with a PhD to come back to China. And that was his mission here. The financial sector. One, you had the stimulus, and then you had the financial sector. We had the TARP money. We had the rescue of, not the rescue of Lehman Brothers, we had the rescue of Bear Stearns with a guarantee from the Federal Reserve. We had AIG. We had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We had Citicorp. A huge amount of government rescue. Did they do the right thing? And what are the implications for the future?
Well, I think first that this crisis reflects a major institutional failure, of course, financial institutions, but also of regulators, of rating agencies, of international agencies that were supposed to be in charge of international cooperation. And the shock was so huge in terms of shattering confidence in basic institutions that the authorities, in a cooperative way, and this is interesting because I think for the first time, I would say in history, you had both emerging and developed countries sitting together and deciding on what actions ought to be done to save the world economy. Because a year ago, we were looking at the abyss, at the precipice. And I think it worked. It worked, but the amounts of money involved are so huge that obviously people are demanding, first of all, much more accountability, more transparency, and a sense of fairness. Why is it that so few have hurt so many. Because that is, I think, the key point, you know. There's a deep sense of unfairness on all this, you know.
A deep sense of
unfairness.
right.
You know? And I think that the task is to restore confidence in the institutions and to restore confidence that those in charge of taking decisions in the financial sector actually are responsible for them. You see, the financial industry is one where the shareholders have limited responsibility. Okay? They only risk their capital. The managers have these agency problems because of the wrong incentives to take excessive risks. Capital is subsidized because you have a lender of last resort, the central bank, and you have deposit insurance. So the incentives are inherently built for financial system to take excessive risks by any kind of social optimism. So that you need regulation. And here the point is, how much regulation? And I think that the industry has been very successful in convincing regulators, not only in the US, but all over the world, that a lightly regulated financial industry would be able to take care of itself. And that has not happened. So I think that there's a process of rebuilding now. And this is what the discussion is. I think the industry would like to go back to business as usual.
Business as usual.
Yeah.
And they're lobbying in Washington as we speak.
Yeah, but that is not acceptable.
To tamp down regulations.
Exactly, and that is not acceptable. And this is why, for example, the compensation and pay and all that is such a, it's not only a political issue, I think it's a social issue. And I think that the forces in the world and in America will make these changes. And this is a process. It has to be sorted out, but we'll end up with a different landscape.
Garth, what ought to be the lessons of this crisis in terms of what we need to do to avoid another kind of bubble, although they tell me bubbles will constantly be developing in any cycle of an economy. But what financial regulations are necessary? Having to do with risk, having to do with too big to fail, having to do with enforcement.
So I think the point that Guillermo makes is correct, that the externalities from the decisions that are made by executives in the financial industry affect not just them, but the entire global system, and therefore they ought to be subject to regulatory scrutiny. There are at least two failures from what happened that ought to be addressed in regulation. One is that the credit rating agencies did an inadequate job of assessing the risk of the mortgage-backed securities that were being sold, and that was the fundamental risk mispricing that echoed around the world. The second is we have deposit insurance for retail banks, and we have no equivalent for large financial institutions. So when they were holding this paper that had been mispriced and was not appropriate for the risk they were carrying, and then confidence began to sap in their holdings on the balance sheet, there were runs on those large financial institutions, which is what caused the panic and put the federal government in the position of having to bail them out with very large amounts of money. And I think
federal government had no option but to bail them out. Otherwise, we were looking at a global crisis.
We were on the brink of financial collapse. The financial system had essentially seized. There was no liquidity for regular business, and if you don't fix that, you do go off the precipice. That was a very scary moment in the last few years. And so something like deposited insurance at the level of large financial institutions, which they could pay for as part of an insurance premium for the collective, could go a long way to preventing those kinds of runs.
Go ahead, Caroline, and then Eric.
Well, I think, if we look back a year ago at this time, things were much scarier. And so at least from the perspective of what the government did at the time with the TARP money, it did keep us from going over that precipice. And I think we all agree that a lot more transparency in the financial sector would be a good thing, because if we had had a lot more transparency, the crisis probably would not have occurred to the same extent it did. That being said, something that we haven't figured out how to solve is how to tell the financial sector, don't take so much risk next time because we don't want to have to go back to taxpayers again the next time you take risks that are too big. Because in fact, what have we done? We've actually sort of taught the financial sector, okay, you took a lot of risk, you created a disaster, we bailed you out. And it's like parents, you know, if you bail out your kids every time they take too many risks, they're going to do it again. So I think.
But again, anyway.
So we do have to figure out a way to change that relationship between, I think, the American taxpayer and the financial sector, because otherwise they will find new ways of taking risks. Sure, they won't do the same type of mortgage-backed securities again, we won't have the same type of reinsurance, but we will have, there are always new financial instruments.
But is the problem what businesses they're in, i.e., whether in the trading business, an investment banking function, or a commercial banking function, or capital requirements? So that there is too much leverage and too much risk-taking, and can you, anybody?
Yeah, I think it's both things, you know. But one particular aspect that we have to watch carefully is the concept of financial innovation. I think financial innovation generally has been very good. You know, the creation of products that serve businesses, that allow households to get credit and small businesses to flourish, and you know those have been the kind of good innovation products. But in the last few years, financial innovation kind of separated from the real sector of the economy. You know? I mean, financial processes are good insofar as they help people or they help businesses, they help the real economy to function better. But when financial innovation is separated from the real sector and you know, it turns into a betting game, for example, we can bet that you may fall off a chair over the next half an hour or so, you know? And that's okay if we do this bet privately. But if we use taxpayers' money implicitly, you know, to take on these bets, there's something very wrong with that.
The argument also goes along in terms of, yes. Penny, the president frequently speaks to the idea that we want to be supporting an economy that is building things, and companies that are building things, not people that are simply engaged in financial engineering.
Right, and so, you know, that's why he's encouraging investments in innovation in green technology and things like this that he thinks are going to not only be good for America, good for our climate, good for our economy, but also help create jobs, which is extremely important. And I think this is an extremely important point, which is this side betting that went on is a really destructive part that got created out of financial innovation. And the real challenge for a new regulatory reform is going to be to dampen that down, but keep the economic growth part of our financial institutions vibrant.
Derek, you had a...
I'm concerned that there will be more and larger bubbles in the future for two reasons. If you look at the sort of history of bubbles, a lot of them have to do with the fact that information markets are getting smaller and quicker. It's possible to have faster bubbles, faster rises and falls. And I see nothing with the globalization. Globalization is not going to slow down in the next 20, 30 years, I don't think. And so it's likely that we're going to see more, not less. The other reason is that there is not a consensus among global leaders. Everyone's upset, but there's not a consensus on how to address the points that have been made here, with some reasonably obvious points like Garth made about risk, about rating agencies, and about compensation schemes. You want to fix this problem, fix the compensation of the actors so they don't act in the way you don't want to. There is not an agreement of how to do that.
all right. John, speak to the...
This is a critical issue. The other component of this is we didn't price liquidity properly. So we acted as if illiquid assets were fully liquid. It's what caught the university endowments. It's what caught the real estate market. It's what caught the enhanced money market funds. They, in fact, were not fully liquid investment strategies. And as a result, once the crisis began, banks and other asset holders couldn't unload their assets and turn them into cash to meet demand for cash.
Do we have, when you look at what's happened here with the government understandably having to intervene, General Motors, Citigroup, AIG, is there an exit strategy? Is there, as Ben Bernanke suggested, a fiscal exit strategy so that things will return to, and what will be the look of where we return to? Anybody? Guillermo?
Well, I think that the
Speaking of a fellow central banker.
yeah. Well, I think that I mean, we all, I think, have agreed that that stimulus had to be put in place because the world economy was in danger of falling off. But the amount of taxpayers' money that is at stake is huge. Not only in the US, but this is also true in Great Britain, it's also true in Europe, in Spain, in many other countries, in Ireland. We may make sure that this works. Because a relapse, if you have a relapse and you have also, I mean, and if you have another episode of, slowing economic growth and another recession or something, there are no more tools there. I mean, because you have already spent what you had. So the timing is crucial here. I think the stimulus has to remain in place until final demand, which ultimately is what is important, really takes hold, and we make sure that the recovery, has firm roots. And I think that is a crucial point. At which point do you retire the monetary stimulus? Because if it takes you too long, you will eventually provoke some inflation. And in terms of the fiscal situation, well, you are already looking at very large fiscal deficits of the next decade, at a rise in public debt in the US and the world. I mean, and a much more active role of public sectors. So this is something that will have to change, And difficult decisions in terms of the fiscal situation will have to be taken by the American people and by people all over the world.
Speak to the deficits that this country's economy is looking at.
Well, they are unprecedented. I mean, the only time we have had deficits that in real terms are of the same size, so inflation-adjusted terms of the same size, was right at the end of World War II. And it was a totally different type of deficit because that was to build a war machine and to keep all of these people in the army and to feed them and so on. And as soon as we ended World War II, the deficit disappeared. And in fact, we went into surplus. We currently have a deficit that is at in my opinion, a totally unsustainable level, but it is to fund mandated benefit programs largely, right. Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. And those things we're not going to stop doing them tomorrow. So it's a much more difficult problem to solve than we had at the end of World War II. I actually think today our debt and our deficit are the single largest risk to the economy. I think the financial sector will... I think the financial sector will come back. How well it's regulated in the future, I don't know, but it will come back.
In some cases, it's already back.
Yeah, that's right, it is. I think our real economy will come back. By that, I mean all the goods and services that we produce in this country. Americans are very entrepreneurial, innovative, flexible people, so lots of jobs will come back in the real sector. But we really do not have any kind of proposed solution on the table for the debt problem and the deficit problem right now. I mean, I really don't see any reason to be optimistic about this problem going away because we do not have the resolve right now to cut government spending enough to get rid of the deficit that way. And I think no one also wants to raise taxes enough to get rid of it the other way. And I think if we raise taxes as much as we would need to get rid of the deficit without cutting spending, we would drive a lot of business out of the United States. So we're in a tough situation.
Garth and then Eric.
Yeah, so I completely agree on the magnitude of the deficit, and it's not clear that we have the resolve to deal with it. But the other side of that is we need to finance those deficits. And the big question is who's going to continue to fund those deficits into the future. It's not clear that foreign sovereign governments will fund these deficits indefinitely into the future, which poses a risk in the longer term for the dollar.
Well, we talked about this before we came on. What happens if they decide not to finance our deficit?
Well, I think our currency already knows what's going to happen if they decide not to fund our deficit. When they decide not to fund our deficit,
the dollar will continue to decline, and no longer will it be attractive.
Right, it's not going to be attractive to fund U.S. debt. I don't mean that they're going to pull out altogether, but that they're going to slow their appetite for U.S. debt. And we're all going to see the falling U.S. dollar in the form of higher prices here, because everything we buy that's from China, say, is going to become more expensive. And we could get into a sort of stagflation situation where the Fed feels it's necessary to rein in the money supply because inflation looks like it's getting out of hand, and then we push the economy back into recession. We don't want that to happen. I think that's what Guillermo was talking about when he said it's so crucial what the timing is. How do we manage to get out of this recession without high inflation, which would push us into tight monetary policy?
Well, Eric?
So if the base case goes something like, we announced a strong dollar strategy, but in fact we have a weak dollar strategy, that we're dependent upon the Chinese and others for monetizing our debt for the next 10, 20 years. We have these ever-increasing debt solutions, and we have these ever-increasing entitlement programs, which our government is happy to continue to make bigger and bigger and bigger because of the way of our political system. Then what's a way out of that path? The only one that I can see is the rebuilding of a manufacturing industry in the United States. And it goes something like this. I don't think the service economy in the U.S. will be strong enough to do it, having to do with the way services are delivered. But because of the strength of the American university system, as evidenced by everybody here, especially here at Stanford, it is possible for America to become sort of a little bit more like Germany, a leader in advanced manufacturing of very sophisticated manufactured goods that are not high volume compared to what is done in the high volume factories in China. So if you imagine a dichotomy where China builds the things which are very low cost, very high manufactured, very much the same, and American ingenuity creates whole new businesses. There's an obvious one in nanotechnology. John is an expert here on some of the things going on at Stanford, which are phenomenal in their impact, in energy, in biotech, and so forth and so on. They will begin to create the jobs that are high-paying, that will pay the taxes, that will help solve the problem you're there. I don't see another way to do it. We need another bubble in America that's not a short-term bubble, but a long one, an investment, a cycle where everybody's just incredibly excited about building these new industries.
What about this idea, but including North America? I seriously think that the potential of the synergies between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico have been way underexploited. And I think that we have, as a bloc, we can really compete and create jobs and become much more efficient. I mean, each one has comparative advantages, but together I think we'll be a lot stronger.
My issue here, and I want to be very clear, is I think there will be a recovery in the United States. The question is, how do we get the kind of jobs that are growing jobs? You talked earlier about this issue of college versus non-college. There's a whole generation of people who benefited from the bubble that we just went through, this credit-induced bubble, who might not have jobs in the future because they don't have the right skills. We need to address this as a society, and the only way I know of to do that is to build these new businesses.
Okay, John, speak to that.
Yeah, I agree with Eric. I think we need to get back into what I would call high-tech manufacturing, not the low-technology manufacturing. We need to form global partnerships because many of these next-generation products, whether they're in the environmental area or they're in conventional information technology, will be built in conjunction between other parts of the world and the U.S. My biggest fear is that the growth in entitlement spending and the inability to tame the debt will mean that this small sliver of discretionary spending where we invest in research, we invest in education in this country, we'll get squeezed out, and we'll have eaten our own seed corn, and then we'll really be in for a crisis. We will not be able to get the kind of economic growth that can support the kind of jobs we want to have in this country.
I think that's exactly right. The evidence is that U.S. growth is increasingly dependent on innovation. In fact, you could say that really the only thing that we're good at anymore is innovation. We're much better than the rest of the world at innovation, maybe not much else. But that means that we should have lots of innovative manufacturing, innovative service industries, innovative all kinds of things. But then John's point becomes especially clear that we can't create innovation without creating the highly educated people who create the innovations, and we need the seed money to do that.
I've got 2 points here. One,
Well,
go ahead, Yum.
it goes back to
Penny.
a public policy question, too, because it's all really tied together. When we started off with immigration, right, and our issues about keeping our brightest people here in the United States so that we can innovate, so that we can do manufacturing, that we also, our relationships around the world need to be strong. We need to manage our relationship with China because we do have a codependency. And they're very clear about the codependency. The Chinese are, they understand our need for their capital, but they want us to become, they actually want us to become a manufacturing and exporting nation because that's good for them as well, for their dollars, for where they're investing their capital. So it's all interrelated with one another.
But the interesting thing, too, though, and I know Eric knows about this and others, it is, there is in China specifically a huge commitment, on solar, huge commitment in terms of a range of alternative energy sources with the huge energy demand they have and their necessity to fuel their growth. At the same time, I'm not sure that we can always rely on this sort of our great pride, and understandable so, in innovation and creativity and those factors that have given us the technology that has fueled our economy. We can't take that for granted because we're much more living in as Tom Friedman said, a flat world where access to information is the same, and they're developing talent bases, and people are understanding that it may be very important to your economy to lead the effort to sustainable energy sources, alternative energy sources, and we need to have a national will in order to be able to compete in the future, not dominate, compete.
No, compete, Charlie. The number one question that I get from people who come from China or India or parts of Latin America, Brazil, how do we replicate the ecosystem of Silicon Valley?
Right.
What's the role of the university? What's the role of the companies? What's the role of government? To stay in Washington, please.
Right. Yeah, but Eric, speak to this only because well, you know what people are doing around the world.
Well, the rise of China is clearly the story for the next 10 to 20 years. It has been for the last 10. We are now dependent upon China in ways that are phenomenally disturbing if you think about it. That if they were to start a set of things that they were to stop doing, we would be in very serious trouble as a country. They're very, very good at the kind of manufacturing that might be needed, for example, for rebuilding the energy infrastructure. There's a concern now that in some core aspects of energy, some of that technology is now better, cheaper, faster in China. So there's an opportunity that we might have already missed. Now, that's not to say there's not another 10 opportunities sitting in front of us if we do what John said. So it is a race. I think the competition is probably quite healthy. It keeps America's ego in check a little bit, which is always good, and it causes us to recognize that there's smart people everywhere.
Somebody said, I remember that Tom Friedman once wrote a quote, once did a story on a column in which he basically talked about his grandmother who said, I'm less worried about a country that tries to censor Google. You remember that? Yeah. But go ahead. Talk about where we are in terms of the president's mind, with respect to all of these issues, in terms of priorities and where we develop the will to engage deficits and how we march on so many different fronts.
Well, I think what you see the president trying to do is to really push the Congress and the Senate to make very bold steps. And he's really fighting a very challenging structure. Our democratic, government is a phenomenal system, and we all believe it's the best system in the world. But to take big, major leaps forward in terms of addressing our climate change problems, in terms of addressing healthcare, in terms of addressing education, requires a lot of will and everyone getting over their own parochial interests, which is very challenging when you have 535 lawmakers, if you will. And what I think you see the president trying to do is to over and over and over reinforce how important these themes are for the future of our country and how important it is that we address them now. And that's frightening to a lot of people, this amount of change this quickly. But I think he's very much on the right track in terms of pushing the Congress as hard as he can.
Mm-hmm. Anybody want to add to that?
I think that the key question is one of resources. And for that, a necessary condition to keep Americans' preeminence in the world, shared with China and all that, but to keep it strong is to really address the problem of the debt and the deficits. But the good news, I think, is that there are precedents. Great Britain was broke in the 1980s. It had a much more difficult problem than the US. It took tough decisions. You look at around in Latin America and in other places in Asia, and many countries had these huge fiscal problems and they were able to resolve them. So obviously it takes will, it takes political agreement, but I think that the US certainly has the tools to resolve this. And comparatively to other countries, the US is in relatively good shape still. So I think this is the most important thing. Once you free resources to devote them to education, to devote them to innovation, so on, I think that the dynamics will change drastically.
Is it, in fact, because of our president's skill at language, is the world, in a sense, looking to the United States today for something?
I think very much so. I think that the image of the U.S. in the world has changed dramatically, and I think that the world is again looking at the U.S. for strong leadership, and this is, I think, a very important point.
But leadership, with the recognition that most of the problems we're looking at, whether it's climate or a whole range of global economic questions, and even geopolitical questions, whether it has to do with Iran or nuclear nonproliferation, all those issues cannot be done alone. And that we do live in an area of engagement, but an area of multilateralism as well.
Well, I agree with what Penny said. I think we are seeing some forward progress. It's a difficult problem working with Congress, but I think if you just look at the re-engagement of the Department of Energy on issues like sustainable energy sources, renewable energy sources, an area we had abandoned as a country for research funding, we're now re-engaged in it, we're focused on it, and we'll get rid of corn-based ethanol, which was never a good solution for our energy problems.
So I think this is right, but I think there's just not enough urgency in Congress.
Urgency.
So the real problem is that the entitlements problem grows over time. So it's always a problem wherever you stand in the future, right? And so we don't tackle it with enough seriousness and engagement. And in the meanwhile, the rest of the world isn't standing still.
And I think that's where the rest of the world does not admire what we're doing. If we look at our European counterparts, they look at our entitlement spending and they say, guys, we thought that you have been telling us for years to control our entitlement spending and control our deficits. And now that we finally started to do it, look at you people. You seem to be out of control. So I think they're There we are not the envy of the world, and we don't want to wait until it's an emergency situation to take care of the problem. You know, we have had times in living memory, all of our living memories, when we ran surpluses in the United States. And those would have been good times to tackle some of these entitlement programs because it's easier to solve the problems when you're running a surplus. But when we're running surpluses, we tend to say, well, that's a problem that's out in the future. And that's not a good way to deal with it, because we need to deal with it before it becomes a huge crisis where Social Security is bankrupt and Medicare and Medicaid are bankrupt. We actually need to deal with it now, and it will make all of our other problems easier
But
to
is it going to
address.
be, go ahead. Penny.
But I think we as citizens have to pressure our representatives to say these are priorities and we're willing to sacrifice in order to have these priorities brought to fruition. But as long as I'm a congressman or a senator and I'm given the priorities are what's going to happen in the next year or 2 years or 3 years, it's very hard to bridge to the future vision of what we want to have.
I think we've also lost the art of compromise. We've lost the ability to bring the parties together and to form a compromise.
And I think, John, you see, referencing back to the president, you see the president very much trying to create bipartisanship and reaching out. And there's a lot of question about that. There's a lot of question about that, but I think that his intention is genuine. And it's very challenging to actually address that in Washington.
I agree with that. In fact, I frequently point out to students that in many ways, the last big aggressive domestic policy reform was welfare reform, led by Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, both commanding leaders of the two sides of the aisles that could bring the country together around something, which is now being copied around the world. So Europe is using the earned income credit scheme now, and so we need to do that again.
Well, and I think we should applaud people like Olympia Snowe, who really took a big political risk.
Yes, absolutely.
She took a huge political risk for the benefit of our country. And what is frustrating is you would like to see more of that.
How much the president can speak to that and the Congress has to speak to that. I hear in the audience a sense of some sense of lack of confidence in certain sectors. Yes. How do leaders address the question of confidence building? You train leaders.
Well, it's through your actions. You have to lay out a vision, and then you have to be willing to show your ability and willingness to make tough choices. And I think that some of that resolve is lacking.
And transparency.
And transparency, of course, yeah.
What issues do you think that we should be speaking to, any of you, that not in terms of this particular roundtable, but the country? What ought to be the debate in this country having to do with the future? What ought to be the questions that are on the table about what kind of country we are and also how we participate in the world? And I say this because we're living in a global world having to do with any country in the world. What ought to be the kinds of questions that we ought to make sure are on the agenda, Eric?
So the question fundamentally is, where does the growth come from?
Right.
If we're not a growth country, we're more or less kaput. And the reason is that all of the systems that we have in place are just going to fight over these incredibly hard to get resources, and everyone's going to be fighting against each other. We have a war of demographics because of life extension, which many other democracies have as well. Everyone else is fundamentally dealing with the problem that the generation that follows them is not going to be able to pay the taxes and what have you to support the people who are older. The combination of those two, we have to deal with the fact that we cannot, for example, decide to spend $1 trillion randomly here, here, and here without a consequence. Or we have to figure out a way to raise that money through, I think, our own creativity.
I think the other thing I'd put on the table, Charlie, is the work that Carolyn's doing on K-12. If we can't offer every young person in this country a decent, opportunity through a good education at K-12, we're sunk. We're sunk. We'll never get it going.
Yeah, but
I want to agree with the gentleman on both sides. We have to grow ourselves out of our problems, essentially, because we have mortgaged the future of our children. And we've done this many times before, and it's been okay. And why has it been okay? It's because our economy has grown enough that our children have not really minded paying off our debts, right? The debts that we imposed on them. But it has to be that the economy grows enough to get us out of this set of problems. Well, why does education matter so much? Education is fundamental fuel for growth in the United States. And it also, especially in K-12, where we have many Americans who really just don't learn basic skills. Literacy and numeracy skills are still problems for many Americans. Those people become the entitlement burden for us in the future because, of course, they're not going to have the skills to earn enough to pay the taxes, to do everything else. So we have to solve education problems in the United States. We can't say that's something that, oh, we need to put that aside while we deal with our short-term problems. We have to think of it as short-term, long-term, medium-term.
because this is reunion weekend, John, this global economic crisis has done what to universities?
Well, I think it's certainly woken us up with respect to how we think about our endowment. My view, it's also created an opportunity for a Nobel Prize in economics when somebody figures out how to price liquidity in an appropriate fashion.
Right.
Obviously, we've lost a lot of resources, as have many of our colleagues at other universities that had significant endowments. We've reset, we've adopted. The universities are not going to go away. The great private universities are still terrific education institutions. They have great students applying to them. They're going to be a little stressed over financial aid for the next few years. My great fear is that our public universities are under tremendous pressure, given what's happened with the states, the fact that they haven't reformed their financial systems. We have to save them.
Go ahead, Carl.
So I'd say for business schools, the crisis has held a mirror up to us. We have to educate principled leaders
So you
for
got
the
to
future.
teach different courses? You have to change your curriculum?
We have to change the curriculum, which we have done here
Right.
at Stanford.
Right.
It's not about teaching finance and marketing and supply
Only.
chain and accounting. You have to teach those things, but you have to educate future leaders of managed institutions who will approach their decision making in a principled way.
About values and things like that. Yeah. Eric, what kind of, Google has made a case always that it has a different kind of culture. What kind of culture ought to exist within business institutions for the future?
Well, it's interesting to say right up front that the Google culture is the Stanford culture. and I mean that with the greatest respect, because
This
the
is the
vast-
Sergey Larry culture?
Absolutely. We modeled Google on their experience in the computer science program here at Stanford. We get 3 or 4 times more graduates from Stanford than from any other university. And so I think in many ways the success of Google reflects the kind of contributions that Stanford has made. When I look at sort of my professional career and what's happened in the Valley, remember the S in Sun is Stanford.
Yes.
Right. So there's more.
What
of
was
that
the
to come.
UN?
University Network.
University Network, Stanford University Network. And so from a Google perspective, what we're trying to do now culturally is we're trying to build cultures that have a lot of people pushed together. It's very much the open model, people working very hard, a sense of changing the world, a sense of working beyond just a paycheck or for a manager. A combination of individual freedom, 20% time to look for ideas and so forth. And the sum of those are models that can be used in many other businesses to get the best of your employees. It's important to remember that a lot of the best ideas do not come from the top in a company, and almost all of the disruptive ideas come from the bottom.
All right.
That's what universities are fundamentally about. The
So-
disruptive ideas come from the students and the faculty.
Right.
That's where the great innovations come from. The president is at the bottom of the pyramid supporting all these people, you see.
With the deans very close.
Yeah, that's right. Very close.
Caroline, what has what has your profession learned, and what lessons are there for you coming out of what we've been through and sort of continuing to come out of?
I hope that the economics profession has a new sense of modesty about its accomplishment. I think actually the thing that
Humility and modesty will
that's
take
right.
you.
No, I'm actually a microeconomist, so I'm not all that humble because it's the macroeconomy that's been doing really badly. But I'll tell you something that we've never really understood, and we knew we didn't understand it, but I don't think we realized how awful it was not to understand it, and that is, we don't have a very good sense of how things play out when they're really integrated across sectors. Now, we would call this problem the general equilibrium problem, that if Penny does something and that causes John to do something and that causes Garth to do something, that causes Eric to do something, all those interconnections are very hard for economists to understand. And what's happened as the world has become more and more integrated is that understanding how all of those connections fit together has become a more important puzzle to solve, and we do not have very good answers to that set of problems. I mean, we knew we didn't, but I don't think we realized that that would cause us to have such a poor response when something like the global financial crisis hit. And I think we didn't have very good answers, and I think we realized we should have had a lot more resources invested in trying to answer questions like that. So I think it's been a very important lesson for the profession, but I don't want to promise people out there that we'll have answered these questions soon because they're very hard questions to answer.
Penny, do you think we'll have less faith in markets? Or have we just gotten over it and now we're back onto
No, I think that
profits and...
No, I don't think that I think that markets are just that. They're markets, and they respond to supply and demand and other factors. I think that, I don't think we're just back at it. I think that there is a cautious awareness of exactly where we're at. As Carol you said, if somebody thinks Google's stock is going to go up, they're going to want to buy Google stock. That's very different than, the day in and day out of other businesses. And so I think that people are cautiously optimistic that markets are working, and that confidence has, there is a certain amount of confidence that has returned. I think that a very important thing was this extraordinary loss of confidence that led us to the precipice of a meltdown. I think that governments stepped in. I think they did a good job of restoring confidence. They're now peeling back the support, slowly trying to peel back support in an effort so that we can continue to operate in markets where we feel, okay, they're functioning again, I can have confidence in them.
But this raises a question which I may close on. We've got just a few minutes left. Is there some new paradigm having to do with any range of things, whether it's government's role in the economy or anything else that we ought to, that is a result of what we have been through? Do we now look at the world in a different way because of our experiences, and is there something that has changed irrevocably and forever?
Well, so I think Carolyn's point was that, for macroeconomists, they need to understand general equilibrium and interconnections.
Right.
I think executives now understand they have to understand interconnections, that focusing just narrowly on your business and your own shareholders and stakeholders is not enough. You need to understand the full context in which you're managing. The financial services managers, the financial services executives who weathered the storm the best were those who didn't just say, I can buy debt for X and I can sell it for X plus a profit, but who asked themselves, why is that price the way it is?
All right, Eric, go ahead, and then I want to change it. Diana, go ahead.
Just real quick, one thing has really changed in the last 5 or 10 years, which has been the explosion of mobile devices and the ability to measure things.
Right.
And we haven't talked much about this, but the fact of the matter is that transparency can be taken to a much greater degree now. And what you learn in the internet business is that people have a lot of free time. They have a lot of time, right? They have a lot of time to look and monitor and analyze.
Yeah.
And from a government policy perspective and a banking policy, I wonder whether the issue of risk mispricing and so forth, had much of that information been more generally available to the average public, average person, would we have been able to detect these things earlier?
Right.
I'm not talking about the institutions who are overworked and understaffed and maybe in some cases the wrong skills. But the fact of the matter is that these crises affect all of us, and all of us have an opportunity, if there's information out there, to monitor what folks are doing, and I think that's healthy.
Okay. Because of you specifically, how is the internet going to change us in ways that it has not already changed us?
Well, one obvious change, which you know very well, has been that much information that people now consume, they actually get from their friends.
Right.
It's essentially user-generated data and so forth. You've seen a sort of a collapse, if you will, of the authority figures of information. This is affecting newspapers and the media in general, and in my view, it's a real issue. But the fact of the matter is that people are largely now influenced by what their friends and other people who they think are like them thinks. That has a lot of positive effects and also some negative effects on our political structure. If you extrapolate that out further, what it says is that every decision we face as an individual or as a country or as a political leader or what have you, will be a shades of gray argument. The people will get so good at spinning their particular point of view, it'll be very, very difficult to tell what the average person really thinks. What does the body populate really think? Because the tools and technology, the democratization of technology, allows everyone to think that they are a famous spokesman or an authoritative, and even though they're not.
All right. Caroline, you spoke about the deficit as a huge concern for you. Why are you optimistic?
Oh, I'm optimistic. Well, I'm an American, so I think it's in the blood. But when I think about the good things that are happening in our economy and the world economy, there are many reasons to be optimistic. I think I take tremendous hope from the fact that despite the crisis, Americans remain very entrepreneurial, very optimistic about the future, very interested in getting back on the horse that they have fallen off of, and we're just a very innovative people, and it's partly because we managed to import so many innovative people from the rest of the world, which is just fantastic. Maybe if we had better visas, we would import even more, but we do that. The other thing I take a lot of hope from is that the internet has really changed the degree to which the world economy can benefit from the many, many innovative people in the world, smart people in the world, who were previously not able to really participate in the world economy because they weren't that linked into it. It used to be the case that when I would talk to, say, an economist from sub-Saharan Africa, I would find that economist was, say, 2 to 3 decades behind where economics was. Now they are a couple of days behind where the profession is because of the internet. And all of a sudden, all of these smart people are going to participate in the world economy. That's a great thing because the world economy grows as we push more and more resources into it, and we've had a lot of underutilized people in the world, and they're now going to be much more utilized. So I'm optimistic about that.
Penny, life's been good. Life's been good to you. What are you concerned about most of all, and why are you optimistic?
Well, I share the view. The reason that I'm optimistic is I believe in America. I believe in our innovative capabilities. I believe in our educational institutions. I believe in our power to evaluate ourselves, to see what we're not doing well, to recognize it, to call it out, and to do something about it. We are a people who are honest with ourselves. And so I have confidence that when faced the realities and the challenges that we're facing that we've talked about today, whether it's the deficit or climate change or education, or the healthcare challenges, we are very aware of those issues and we're facing them. And it's hard to do. But the fact is we're actually facing them and people are making tough decisions. And so that's why I'm optimistic.
Right. Guillermo, Mexico was this long border of the United States and all kinds of issues that demand cooperation, whether it's immigration, whether it's weapons coming over, whether it's drugs coming back, whatever it is. Is there optimism that governments will be able to, in the future, for lots of reasons, cooperate to deal with problems that have no geographical definition?
Well, first, the degree of international cooperation that we have had with this crisis, I think, is unprecedented. So that is a good sign. I think that the G20 that met exactly a year ago in the middle of the crisis, for the first time, got both emerging and developed countries acting together in coherent and cooperative policies. Now, in relation with Mexico, there are two levels of the relationship. One has to do with the everyday business of trade, of investment, of the drug problem, arms, and so on and so forth. And this is something that has to be, I would say, taken with a view, with a long-term view, that the problems will have to be solved, and will have to be solved through cooperation. And the key to as to whether we're going to be optimistic on that or not is whether we have at the leadership level a sufficient, I would say, leadership and will to connect these things. We did NAFTA a few years ago, and that was something very positive, I think, for the hemisphere as a whole. So I am also I'm not an American, but I'm also very optimistic. I'm a Stanford graduate, maybe that's a reason. But I think that our two countries will eventually come to terms on the more difficult issues, which is like the drug thing and the many positive aspects of this relationship in terms of job creation, synergies, and so on, are the really important aspects that we have to focus on.
Yeah. One thing is, and we clearly is a lesson of our time, is that, and I think this president has reinforced it, is that we have to listen to others, and we have to let them know, that we understand where the complications of their own time and their own life and their own challenges. We conclude this before a couple of final remarks with your president on this reunion weekend. How would you sum up what we've heard this morning, and where we are?
Well, Charlie, I think it's clear from the discussions we've had that we've seen that we have a lot of challenges. I think we have challenges in Washington to solve some of the problems and ensure that we don't get back in the jam that we've gotten in. But I think as you went around through the panelists here, I think you heard a sense of optimism. When I greeted the new group of incoming students last month, that's why I'm optimistic. They're energetic. They're excited to be here. They're looking through course catalogs saying, I don't know how I'll get all these courses in that I want to take. And they are determined to make a difference in the United States and around the world.
They are you, and they are your sons and daughters. Coming home for a reunion is a wonderful experience, and so I'm pleased to have been able to share this time with you in this remarkable panel, and all I can end with is saying good luck to the Cardinals tonight. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you. It was very fun. Terrific to meet you as well. That was good. That was really
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.